Hi, my name is Phil Howard. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Washington and work in the Department of Communication. And I've been invited to give a short 10-15-minute talk about my paper, Testing the Leapfrog Hypothesis. Let me start off by thanking Dr. Brian Loader, who's a professor at the University of York in the UK. He's also editor of the journal that this article is coming out in, Information, Communication, and Society. I think it'll be out in June, and he's invited me to do a video podcast. So my goal for the day is to talk a little bit about the research, perhaps walk through the tables and highlight some of the conclusions. And my email is pnhoward@u.washington.edu. I welcome any feedback you have for the direction of this research or the arguments in the article. Let me start off with a quick 30 seconds about me. As I said, I teach in the Department of Communication. My background is, I guess, intellectually diverse. I have an undergrad degree in poli-sci from the University of Toronto, a master's in economics from the London School of Economics, and a PhD in sociology from Northwestern. And my current appointment is in the Department of Communication. So I feel like I've been studying the same set of issues all along, but different schools and different intellectual traditions seem to give different labels to these things. Currently, I'm interested in how information technologies are distributed around the world and who gets access to what and why. And one of the most common metaphors we use in development research is the metaphor of the leapfrog. The metaphor of the leapfrog is popular because it's easy to envision, and it's the basic idea that a country can skip ahead of its neighbors by making the right kind of strategic investments in information technologies. And the most common example sometimes offered as cell phone uses. So a poor country that invests a lot of money in landline telephones today has a fairly old infrastructure. The poor country that didn't invest in landline telephones and saved up, waited for the new exciting technology of mobile phones, that country can skip ahead, doesn't have to make the infrastructure investment, and can go right to having the latest communications infrastructure. It turns out, according to the numbers that I've crunched in this paper, that there are surprisingly few countries we might actually consider a leapfrog, or consider to have leapt. Let's see. Let me start, I think, by highlighting the key findings. It turns out when you crunch the numbers that there are very few leapfrog countries, that is, countries who have significantly jumped ahead of their neighbors in terms of the number of mobile phones, internet users, personal computers, secure servers, and internet hosts. Those were the 5 information technologies that we have relatively good data on, and those are the 5 information technologies I studied in the paper. The second big finding is that not only are there very few countries that have really leapt ahead, but most of those countries that we could reasonably call leapfrog countries are already the rich ones. They're the countries of the OECD. There's a few obvious examples like India and China and Brazil that have leapt ahead in certain categories of information technology. But surprisingly, we use this metaphor of the leapfrog to refer to poor countries skipping ahead. Surprisingly, it's mostly the rich countries that we can reasonably say have skipped ahead with more information technology relative to their neighbors. So my way of looking at this data is to say, how much of the global share of information infrastructure does a particular country have? It turns out that it's a fairly small list. The second interesting finding is that a few information technologies are actually more concentrated today than they were back in 1995. Personal computers, internet hosts, and secure servers have barely improved in their international distribution. That is, the global share of information technology isn't very evenly distributed. In a perfectly equal world, we could imagine that, say, of 200 countries, each country would have 1/200th of the global share of information technology. And it turns out it's not that fairly distributed. There are a few countries that have most of the information technology, and most of the countries have a tiny sliver of the global share. Even when weighted by population, this is one of the tables that I get to in the paper, even when you weight by population, the distribution is pretty inequitable. The one technology that's improved a lot for global distribution is the mobile phone technology. I'll talk in a minute about Gini coefficients and what those measures reveal and what they hide. The third finding is that the list of countries, not only is the list of countries that have leapt ahead small, not only are they already the rich countries, but it's actually very difficult to tell which kinds of policy reform have had a positive impact on technology adoption. That is, the common wisdom, the received wisdom, is that certain kinds of neoliberal reform in the telecom sector will bring about an information society in your country. It turns out that the connection is not very strong and is actually slightly negative. That is, a few of the forms of policy reform that we study here turn out to have a negative effect on the proportion of infrastructure you have. Now, the time frame from the study is 95 to 2005. There's some data from the ITU and the World Bank that goes back to the 90s, but the most important chunk of time, I think, for this problem is 95 to 2005, so that's the period I was working with. Let me run through the tables. I think everybody has their own way of reading articles, and mine is to do the abstract and then skip ahead to the bibliography, then do the tables, and then maybe the conclusion. So let me do the same thing to my own paper. I start off with a lit review of the major factors that contribute to the digital divide. And one of the reasons this lit review is important for an article is that it lets you contextualize a debate and highlight a few of the things that are actually very contentious. At the moment, there's a bit of a debate going on over the role of social capital or human capital in explaining the digital divide. That is, there are some people who say the digital divide can mostly be accounted for by economics. Rich countries have lots of technology and poor countries don't have very much. There are critics who say, well, there's more to the digital divide than simply technology access. It's also about skills and education. It turns out when we're crunching the numbers and reviewing the literature that it's actually very hard to show a connection between this education and literacy and computer use. So intellectually, people can make an argument that education, literacy is important for skills. It makes sense that somebody's skill set would explain whether they use information technologies. But the numbers don't actually bear up on that relationship. And there are several articles that I cite in the lit review that suggest even though for theory reasons there probably should be a connection between literacy and education as explaining the digital divide, most of the research that's out there doesn't show or doesn't find a connection between this thing. Some people are calling it a second-order digital divide or a third-order digital divide. The first-order digital divide is technology access, the simple fact of availability. The second-order digital divide is supposed to be technology skills. It's possible that the data doesn't capture the second-order digital divide very well. It's possible that there is no second-order digital divide, or that the second-order digital divide isn't really a coherent concept on its own. When we do qualitative work on particular countries, many people report that education and literacy are key to closing the digital divide. From a global perspective, with the data we have from the World Bank and the ITU, that connection isn't so clear. So we'll see later on in the models that, as with some of the other research, the human capital factors actually drop out for parsimonious reasons. After the lit review, the first table you'll hit is table 1A and 1B. Of course, it started off as one big table, and once you make it through production, you realize that your gorgeous tables that you've done in Microsoft Word don't actually play out well in a formatting program. So it's now a two-parter. Table 1A displays the average rise in share of global ICT between 1995 and 2005. So on average, for the 5 different technologies I'm covering, I sampled between 170 and 200 countries. In each category, a significant number of countries have a smaller portion of technology in 2005 than they did back in 1995. The number of countries with a slightly larger share, that is, their portion of global infrastructure increased, is pretty small. And the proportion of countries who have an above average increase, that is, there's an average increase in a country's share of ICT, and the above average increase is fairly small. For mobile phones, there are about 20 countries who have a lot more mobile phone usage than their neighbors over time. Personal computers, another 20 countries. Internet users, about 27 countries. Internet hosts, 12 countries. Secure servers, 8 countries. I should say that the secure servers data doesn't go back to 95. I believe it's 2001 and 2004 that we have those 2 snapshots to work with. But I include them because there's relatively good data, and it's important not to throw out data. Table 1b is a list of the countries, and this, I think, is the kind of table that will provoke the most debate. It's a list of the countries that we could actually consider to be leapfrog countries. And as you'll see, when your eye reads over the table, glances over the table, most of the countries that qualify as leapfrog countries are in the high income bracket, upper middle, or the upper middle income bracket. There are relatively few lower middle income countries who've had an increase in their share of global ICT. And of the lowest income countries, it's basically India, Nigeria, Bangladesh, and Vietnam. They are the lowest income countries that have had some modest increase in their share of global ICT. ICT is information and communication technologies. And there are no low-income countries who've leapt ahead in terms of secure servers. Actually, there are no lower middle-income countries who've leapt ahead in secure servers. And that's kind of intuitively sensible. We'd sort of expect that secure servers are used for economic transactions, banking, money transfers. So we'd sort of expect that mostly rich countries would have secure servers, and poor countries would be less likely to invest in that kind of infrastructure. Moving ahead, after a discussion of some of the variables that will ultimately get dumped into some models, Table 2 is a table of Gini coefficients. Gini coefficients are often used by economists to describe the distribution of a resource. So in a perfectly equitable society, 35% of the people would have 35% of the income, and 99% of the people would have 99% of the income. Any deviation from that straightforward relationship is a source of inequality, and that's what Gini coefficients measure. As I said, most people apply Gini coefficients to income, and I decided to see what would happen if we applied Gini coefficients to technology access. And there's some interesting findings. You can do this, you can weight the distribution of technology by nation states, or you can weight the distribution of information technologies by nation states relative to population. I'll just talk about the population weights because those are probably the most interesting. It turns out that mobile phones are the most evenly distributed information technology. The Gini coefficients are a range of numbers from 1 down to 0. So 0 being a perfectly equitable situation, and 1 being a perfectly inequitable situation. In 1995, mobile phones had a global distribution Gini of 0.67. In 2005, that had dropped down to 0.13. That is, mobile phones were very evenly distributed around the world. Surprisingly, internet hosts are still pretty concentrated. Personal computers and internet users are well distributed, not as well distributed as mobile phones. I won't read out the numbers. You can grab those from the tables, the paper itself. It's interesting to me that internet users are well distributed around the world, but internet hosts and secure servers aren't. That suggests to me that there's some kind of dependency relationship in that the infrastructure for internet use seems to be pretty concentrated, but the people who are using the internet are actually pretty well distributed. This means that there are a lot of countries with lots of internet users, but with a very poor national level information infrastructure. So that's table 2. Table 3, some descriptive stats that everybody has to put in when you start crunching numbers. I should talk a little bit about the types of regulatory reform. I wanted to move beyond a simple model of what explains the digital divide and actually put in some policy stuff. There are 4 types of policy reform that are often done in developing countries, usually at the evocation of the World Bank or ITU, often through some kind of contingency lending program. So they'll say, a multilateral lending institution will say, we'll give you a chunk of money for a project, but you have to sell your national telecom provider. Or you have to depoliticize your regulatory body. Or you have to separate the regulatory body from the executive branch. Or you have to open up your local telecom markets to competition. These are the 4 types. Selling the major telecom provider, separating the regulator from the executive branch, actually removing all the politicians from the regulator, putting in technocrats, and opening up the local markets to telecom reform. Those are the 4 types. I went back through several countries and used another data set to supplement my information to figure out what year each country had done each of these types of reform. And there are plenty of countries who haven't done any reform at all. But I went back and figured out what years, and I calculated the number of years that each country had done each type of reform. So in theory, if we think this kind of reform will have an impact on whether you're an information society or not, a country that's done 20 years, that is, they privatized their telecom provider 20 years ago, and they did some regulatory reform 20 years ago, if there's a relationship between reform and becoming an information society, we'd expect that country to have a much better info society than we would a country which had just started regulatory reform last year. So 20 years of reform having been in place and businesses getting used to things and customers getting used to the new regulations. 20 years of reform should have a big impact, a bigger impact certainly than just doing the reform a few years ago. And so I plugged those numbers into the final models. Now, the final models include a couple of economics variables, a couple of infrastructure variables, including electric power consumption, number of telephone main lines, the cost of a local phone call, some basic demographics, population, secondary school enrollment, rate of urbanization, the basic democracy score, which you can get from the Polity 4 data set, and then these 4 types of reform. So in the lit review, I go through and explain where all these variables come from. They're a standard set of variables that we use when we study information access around the world. And it turns out that the only positive impact of privatization is on personal computers. That is, the only statistically significant impact that we can measure is on the distribution of personal computers. So if your country privatized the national telecom regulator several years ago, your country is more likely to have more personal computers. The relationship just isn't there for the other 4 technology types: mobile phones, internet users, internet hosts, and secure servers. If you separated or depoliticized your regulatory body, that has a slight impact on personal computers, but it's a negative impact. And the same with mobile phones. That is, if you depoliticized your regulatory authority, or you removed all the politicians, separated it from the executive branch, that's a slight negative impact on the number of internet hosts you're likely to have, or the number of mobile phones you're likely to have. Same thing with market liberalization. If you've had many years of market liberalization in your country, you're less likely to have a lot of mobile phones. it's quite statistically significant. You're less likely to have more personal computers, internet users, and internet hosts. Now, what explains these kinds of trends? It's possible, or it's likely, that there are a few important countries that have had bad experiences with this kind of neoliberal telecom reform. So, for example, if a multilateral lending institution tells a country to sell its national regulator, you're not supposed to sell the regulatory body. If a multilateral lending institution tells a country to sell the national telecom provider, and you depoliticize the regulator at the same time, then that may create some kind of a public policy vacuum. That is, without politicians watching who you're going to sell your telephone company to, you may end up selling it, say, to the brother of the president. I think this was the case in Mexico, where they depoliticized the regulatory system, put the national telecom provider up for sale, and the brother of the president bought it. I imagine that there are other examples in the developing world where depoliticizing at the same time as privatizing actually resulted in bad public policy choices. Selling your telecom provider to businesses that weren't interested in investing in the local infrastructure. In the case of Tanzania, I know that the national telecom provider was privatized, and the company that bought it had promised to increase the number of landlines. 5 years later, they hadn't increased the number of landlines. In fact, they stopped repairing the existing landline infrastructure, so the telephone infrastructure was even worse off. And this company revealed that they were really interested in the license for mobile phones. So they did develop the phone infrastructure, but only the mobile phone infrastructure. And that isn't the infrastructure that most of the poor people in Tanzania use. The landline infrastructure is a little more stable and a little bit more accessible for the extremely poor. So I suspect that a lot of the stories, what explains the negative impact of these kinds of policy reform, is perhaps the idea that when you do policy reform, it can actually be good to have political oversight. That is, it may be a positive thing to privatize your information infrastructure, privatize your telecom provider and open up the markets, local markets, for competition, but you actually do want the public, or the politicians, to watch things. You do want a regulatory body that's stable so that they can oversee these things and make sure that the national infrastructure is built up in coherent ways. If you don't have that kind of public policy oversight, you probably are one of the countries that's suffering under this kind of telecom reform. Thanks for the opportunity, again, to Professor Loader to talk about the paper. This paper is part of a larger project called the World Information Access Project. This is the 2006 briefing book. We printed 1,000 copies of these and sent them out, and we're doing our 2007 briefing book. Hopefully it'll be a big map about information access around the world. And the project website is www.wiareport.org, World Information Access Report.org. And all of our findings go up there. In fact, a lot of the data that was used in this paper is on the website, and you're welcome to use it, download it, and play with it. Thanks again for the opportunity to speak. My name is Phil Howard from the University of Washington. Look forward to your comments and feedback. Cheers.